Hello, I'm the Reverend Ben Randall, Senior Associate Rector here at Galilee Episcopal Church in Virginia Beach. And this is session 2 of our Lenten 2024 teaching series, which we're calling The Tales of Triumph. Last time, in the first instalment, we heard from Father Andy about the martyr Ignatius of Antioch, who was killed for the faith by lions at the beginning of the 2nd century AD. We heard too about Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, who came to power against the odds, perhaps with heavenly help, in the early 4th century. Now we're jumping forward in time, about 1,000 years, no less. We're going from antiquity to the Middle Ages. But don't be surprised if we circle back some in later sessions. I want to start with a confession. I don't love Shakespeare. Maybe I'm a Philistine, or perhaps more likely I'm just too stupid. But I do have a soft spot for what's called his second tetralogy, a series of 4 plays that dramatise the rise to power of King Henry V in the 14th century. These plays, in some part, have been made into movies several times, including quite recently with Tom Hiddleston, Loki from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's a fine actor. But the most magnificent version, if you ask me, was the one with Kenneth Branagh, released in 1989. And if you haven't seen it, you must immediately after this rent it on Amazon Prime or wherever you enjoy watching your films. The patriotic speeches that Shakespeare puts into the mouth of the young prince, Henry's mouth that is, as he seeks to inspire his exhausted little army in their various confrontations with the superior French force, will inspire you to burn your American passports and apply for asylum at the nearest British embassy. They're really that good, stirring stuff. Well, in the plays, one of the principal protagonists, initially at least, is John Falstaff, a knight, though there's nothing knightly or noble about him. John Falstaff is grossly fat, he's a drunkard, a jokester, a frequent visitor to the whorehouse. He won't take anything seriously, especially not religion. He's also King Henry's best friend, and as such a very, very bad influence. But what you may not know is that John Falstaff had a completely different name when the plays were originally performed for the public. Originally, the roguish Sir John Falstaff was called Sir John Oldcastle. And famously, notoriously, Oldcastle was indeed Henry's BFF in his youth, though in reality Oldcastle was nothing like how Shakespeare portrays him. In fact, Shakespeare's portrayal was seen correctly as a smear, as a character assassination. And justifiably there was an outcry from British evangelicals who regarded Oldcastle as a hero born before his time. Specifically, they understood him to be a proto-Protestant, a Protestant before really there were such things, strictly speaking. And it is Oldcastle's story that I want to share with you today. Shakespeare, of course, lived during the reign of Elizabeth I in the 16th century, at a time when the kingdom was still divided, still conflicted, and I mean that literally, they were at each other's throats over the matter of the Reformation. Divided, conflicted about its necessity, about its propriety. Basically, simplistically, the reformers, men like Martin Luther, John Calvin and Thomas Cranmer and others, basically they challenged the prestige of the papacy by attempting to shift authority away from the priests and then back to the text itself. And thanks to the recent invention of the printing press, the text was finding its way, slowly but surely, back into the hands of ordinary Christians in Shakespeare's day. Books were still rather expensive for them to buy, but at least now when they attended church on a Sunday, the Bible readings were read to them in a language they actually understood and not in Latin. And it is hard to exaggerate just how significant this development was. Translating the Bible so that every Christian could read it in their own mother tongue was a central aspect of the Reformation and a revolutionary thing to do. You know, I once heard it said that, and I quote, The Western world today is an extraordinarily complex, tangled product of rejections, retentions, and transformations of medieval Western Christianity, in which the Reformation era constitutes the critical watershed, the point of no return. And John Oldcastle, he played a small part to fetch us to that watershed. That is to say, in a small way, John Oldcastle helped bring us our Bibles. When he was born in about 1370, hardly anyone in what became the UK could read the Bible, even if they were lucky enough to own one. There had been some piecemeal attempts during the Saxon period to translate scripture into English, carefully copying every word by hand, by the monk that we call the Venerable Bede in the 7th century, for example, by some scribes employed by King Alfred the Great in the 9th century. But the church resisted, or at least wasn't interested, in these sporadic translation projects, and the Norman conquest set things back a bit too, so that for hundreds and hundreds of years, for more than a millennium in fact, English-speaking Christians couldn't read God's holy, inspired word for themselves. And quite rightly, this situation was deeply concerning, in particular to a grumpy but Christ-loving lecturer of theology at the University of Oxford called John Wycliffe. Wycliffe took it upon himself to train teams of lay preachers, and he began supervising the translation of the Bible into the vernacular for them to use. These preachers went about England in pairs, wearing distinctive red cloaks, almost sort of like a uniform. They would preach at fairs, in marketplaces, in churches, and in private homes, teaching the simple truths of primitive Christianity with zeal and simplicity, and they were very successful at it. One historian speaks of how the kingdom became honeycombed with supporters, especially among some of the wealthy. The movement developed into a more or less surreptitious congregationalism, a parallel, covert Christianity that coexisted alongside the so-called respectable Vatican variant. And this was very threatening to the established ecclesial hierarchy and their political allies, who vigorously, sometimes with violence, impeded Wycliffe and his pupils in every way that they could. In documents from the period, court documents of people put on trial, Wycliffe's group were denounced as Lollards. We have no idea as to the meaning of the word. There are various theories, but clearly it was meant as a term of ridicule. And Wycliffe himself was personally denounced by the Pope, who issued an official written sanction calling on Wycliffe to cease and desist his activities. Facing relentless pressure, Wycliffe died a sickly man of a stroke, a victim of medieval cancel culture. The authorities, however, weren't done with him yet. They dug up his body from the cemetery and they threw it into the local river. But as I've said, this tale isn't about Wycliffe. This tale is about Oldcastle. So John Oldcastle was, at some point, probably in his youth, persuaded by Lollard thinking that the foundation of a Christian's relationship with Jesus ought to be the Bible. Not attending religious services, not receiving the sacraments, not pastors or preachers. No, the Bible ought to be the foundation. Those other things I mentioned, those things are good, they're very good, they have undeniable utility, but they are a house built on sand apart from the scriptures, apart from the subjective transformation brought about in the soul of an individual by hearing the convicting truth in the text. After all, Jesus said, didn't he, that it's the truth that shall set you free. John 8:32. Now, Oldcastle was a tough, battle-hardened warrior, a veteran of many hard campaigns in Ireland, in Scotland, in France, and most of all, many times against the Welsh. You know what they're like, those lousy leek lovers. They're the worst. I'm joking, of course. The Welsh today are known as a gentle people, a people of poetry and song. Pretty good on the rugby pitch, I can tell you. Well, in Oldcastle's time, they were quite different. They were troublesome. Indeed, what we see again and again is the Welsh would deliberately time their raids into England, claiming themselves independent. And Oldcastle, he lived right on the border. He lived in a place called Hereford. Again and again, year after year, he accompanied the royal armies that came from London when they marched through his county into the valleys of Wales beyond to catch and punish the troublemakers. The unrest in the region, you see, was very costly. The Welsh, as I say, timed their attacks for harvest time. They would come and they would steal the grain stored in the barns for winter and burn the crops that hadn't yet been reaped. This led to famine and hardship. It was a volatile, almost apocalyptic scenario that shaped Oldcastle into someone who knew really only how to do one thing: to fight. Oldcastle was a hammer, always looking for a nail. Despite his friendship with King Henry, therefore, what happened next was perhaps inevitable, when he came to the realization that the church itself and the crown were the obstacles to the gospel. This was undeniable in light of their disgraceful treatment of Wycliffe, and the atmosphere was getting only worse, more hostile, more punitive. But Oldcastle wasn't a man easily intimidated. He wrote letters to the leaders of other underground proto-evangelical groups agitating for change on the continent, to the Hussites in Bohemia, in what is today the Czech Republic, encouraging them to stand firm in the face of the persecution that they were suffering over there. This was a step too far for the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Arundel. That's right. He was a Randall. One of my forebears, I guess. This Archbishop Arundel denounced Oldcastle as a heretic to Henry in public at the palace. And he had proof. He had hired thugs to steal correspondence and pamphlets from Oldcastle, which clearly evidenced that he was an enthusiastic, Bible-reading, Bible-distributing Lollard. There was no way for Henry to sweep this under the rug, not now. Archbishop Arundel had already taken steps to publicise Oldcastle's conviction for heresy around the kingdom by sending copies of the proceedings against him to the bishops of the southern province, with instructions that the official condemnation of his opinions be read in every parish. Oldcastle was excommunicated, arrested, and condemned to die. But whilst Henry couldn't cover up the situation, what he could do was delay his friend's execution. Oldcastle was given 40 days to recant. 40 days which he used instead to plan a daring escape from the Tower of London, fighting his way to freedom with some friends. Now, on the run, Oldcastle didn't have much time. He was a dead man walking. There were literally assassins out hunting for him. And so it seems, under Oldcastle's leadership, the Lollards formed some wild plan of revolt, a coup. Oldcastle gathered a force of allies and mercenaries and actually marched back into London, into the capital city, on January 7th, 1414, intending to force a religious revival by overthrowing the government. Or is that what happened? Oldcastle's entire force numbered only a few hundred persons. There were women and children with him too. Some had brought their lunch. Scholars say that many of the people with him weren't even carrying weapons. If this was a sincere attempt to seize control, then it looks half-baked. It looks ridiculous. In fact, I have found myself wondering about the possible similarities that may or may not exist between Oldcastle's insurrection on January 7th and the more recent unhappy episode of January 6th, 2021. Anyway, don't be distracted by that. I probably shouldn't have said anything. Focus on this. Focus on the fact that the coup, if that's what it was, ended in complete disaster and embarrassingly quickly. But Oldcastle himself escaped in the confusion. Consequently, letters were sent from Westminster to sheriffs promising that anyone who could provide information that led to Oldcastle's arrest would receive a pile of gold and, best of all, listen to this, I quote, permanent exemption from all forms of taxation for life. Yet, nonetheless, Oldcastle evaded capture for almost 3 years. He was seen everywhere and nowhere. One sympathetic priest who hid Oldcastle in his own rectory for a period was made an example of and put to death. So, Oldcastle started another rebellion. Lollards spread the word and began painting war banners depicting a chalice and a loaf of bread, the Eucharistic elements. But widespread arrests nipped this other insurrection in the bud. Then, in October 1417, Oldcastle made a break for the border. It seems like maybe he intended to make common cause with his old enemy the Welsh. But, by a stroke of bad luck, Oldcastle was intercepted by soldiers, disarmed, and brought back to London in chains. But what to do with him? Here, King Henry, Oldcastle's BFF, remember, and the church faced a difficult dilemma. According to the law of the land, as a traitor, Oldcastle was supposed to be executed by hanging. But as a heretic, which is how they saw him, he was supposed to be killed by burning. It was a conundrum. What to do? They decided on an ingenious compromise, to do both. They strung him up by his neck on some gallows, and as he squirmed on the rope, choking, they set fire to him. Et voila, the circle was squared. This series, of course, is called Tales of Triumph. So why then reflect on the life of Sir John Oldcastle and his Lollards, given what I've just described? It sounds nothing like a triumph, does it? Rather the opposite. Well, firstly, I would say that if Oldcastle made a mistake, if he was misguided, it was because, like St. Paul, Oldcastle was a fool for Christ. And I don't see that as a fault. In fact, I applaud him. Oldcastle was like the merchant in the parable in the Gospel of Matthew, who sold all he had for the most precious pearl of all, abundant life with his Lord. Secondly, believe me when I say never trust a Randall. They're bad news, obstacles to the kingdom. And thirdly, and this is really what I would want you to take away from all this, the Lollards and Oldcastle, they have been described as a reformation before the Reformation, as an important springboard for the Reformation. It is said that the Lollards provided a well-fertilised English soil for the Reformation, preparing hearts and minds to be receptive for the changes in doctrine that were about to come from Europe. And so this story challenges us, I think. It certainly challenges me in a number of ways, but in particular perhaps, it challenges us to recognise how each one of us is, whether we admit it or not, an essential link in a chain. A link in a chain between the faithful of the past and the potential faithful of the future who are counting on us. As disciples, we have a duty to the Christians who could be. And the question is, am I playing my small part in this chain that Jesus has commanded of me? I'm referring to his so-called Great Commission, Matthew 28, verse 19, where he tells us to go therefore and make disciples. When we hear those words, we tend to think of the responsibility being laid upon us only one-dimensionally, as a horizontal matter, about our duty to tell those currently living about Christ and him crucified. And of course, absolutely, we're right to think in that way. But what about those not yet born? What legacy do we leave to them? Will they find a church strengthened by my participation or diminished by it? There's enough there, I think, for some reflection and conversation. God bless you.